Yep.
Are we recording?
We
okay.
are.
Yeah, so we're good. We're on the air. So hello, everyone. So the topic we're going to discuss today is late antiquity. I would say that most people with some understanding of history have inherited a tripartite periodization of history from the Renaissance humanists, where you have an ancient period. This would be a periodization of Western history, right? So starting with the Greeks and Romans, and then with the fall of the Roman Empire, you have the beginning of the Middle Ages, and then sometime in the 15th or 16th century, you have the transition to the modern period. But in the 20th century, there were a number of historians, starting, we could say, a locus of this way of thinking would be, for example, Henri Perren's Muhammad and Charlemagne. And then Peter Brown in the 70s wrote a book on the world of late antiquity, which promoted a different kind of periodization, variously conceived, but we could say roughly starting with the 3rd century crisis of the Roman Empire, and then going on to Islam. And even beyond to the Carolingian, the beginnings of the Carolingian Empire in Europe and so forth, looking at this period as being really the transition from the classical to the medieval world, and really a time of great importance. And obviously, if you look at that block of time, you have figures like Constantine and Muhammad, right? Both of whom were clearly world historical figures who are associated, we could say, with the rise of the monotheisms, and as well as the declines of the old polytheistic religions of the classical world and so forth. So we could say that there are indeed a radical set of changes going on in Europe and the Middle East. Here to talk with us about the themes of late antiquity, which he has written on, is a very distinguished guest, Dr. Stephen Balch. He is his background, his doctorate is in political science, but he was the president and chair of the National Association of Scholars. He won the National Humanities Medal under President Bush in 2000, he was given to him by President Bush 2007, and the Jeane Kirkpatrick Academic Freedom Award. He was the former president and chairman of the National Association of Scholars, and is currently the director of the Institute for Western Civilization and Texas Tech. So a very distinguished guest. And so would you like to say hello to the audience?
Hi there, everybody. Delighted to virtually meet you all.
Very good. And we have Miles, Dr. Miles Smith here as well. Miles, you want to say hello to everybody?
Hello, everyone. It's great to be with both of you and the audience today, actually.
Okay, well, I guess a good way to get started would be to ask Steve what he thinks as some of the major themes that are important in this period of history. I mean, I know from reading some of your work, you've talked about the anti-axial age and this sort of thing. So why don't you just explain a little bit why you think this particular period of history is significant?
Well, I'd give 3 reasons. First off, as far as what will become the Western world is concerned, it consummates the marriage of classical antiquity, essentially of the Greek Hellenistic heritage, with the Judaic heritage, when Christianity becomes, which is a synthesis of the two and a few other things besides, when Christianity becomes the religion of the Roman Empire. Secondly, on a broader scale, It's a period in which what I would call the Great West Eurasian Religious Revolution occurs. Up until that time, West Eurasia, if you forget about Judaism, was very much like the rest of Eurasia in not only being polytheistic, but not having organized, centralized, state-endorsed churches. Under the Romans, while there were particular Roman cults, all sorts of religions flourished and spread through the Mediterranean. That would have been true certainly in South Asia, and it was true in its way in East Asia. But when the period ends, you have two great monotheisms, Christianity and Islam, and they are busily not only repressing what's left of polytheism, and it was alive and well when Christianity certainly comes into ascendancy. But they are also, in their various ways, placing constraints on other aspects of intellectual life, particularly philosophizing, which hadn't existed before. Not only that, but these religions, these monotheistic religions, have a different character than the religions of the past. They have incorporated into themselves and then given to the states that have made them official doctrine what I call the millennial narrative, a view of history in which the world is a theater of struggle between good and evil at cosmic levels. And that struggle is heading towards a showdown. It's not clear exactly when that showdown will occur. Early Christians thought it was coming very soon, but in any event, it's heading toward a showdown in which the good will triumph. And when this particular millennial narrative is taken over by states, by empires, they are putting themselves in the vanguard of the forces of good. They are giving themselves a new ground for legitimacy and potentially a ground for expansion and aggression against those who don't hold to their faith, because clearly those folks are on the wrong side of the struggle between good and evil. It seems likely to me that the ultimate root of this idea is neither, it's not Christianity, it's not really Judaism so much as it is Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, which goes back, if the chronologies that are generally accepted are correct, goes back sometime to the middle of the 2nd century BCE. Zoroastrianism was the first to posit history in these terms. And it's taken up before Rome becomes Christian. The first step of the West Eurasian religious revolution actually occurs in Persia. It occurs in Persia at the beginning of the Sasanian dynasty, when the first ruler of that dynasty, who had just overthrown the Parthians, wants to create a much more centralized state than the Parthians had, and decides, he's actually of priestly background, Ardashir. He's of priestly background. His family are Zoroastrian priests. Decides that his new regime is going to have to stand on two legs. We have inscriptions carved into rock in Persia about this. And the two legs are going to be, obviously, the political authority and the military authority on the one hand, but on the other hand, religion. There's going to be, for the first time, on a large scale, not just a city, but on a really extensive scale, a official state religion. And it's going to have, Ardashir and his successors provide for this, it's going to have a hierarchy of fire temples in this case. It's going to have a high priest, a kind of archmagus. It's going to have a canonical literature, and the early high priests start assembling this. It's probably why we have a Zoroastrian canon at all. They do the work. So they're creating a model, and it's a model clearly they thought would work, and they do create a more centralized state. But that one has to believe, though I don't think there's kind of any direct evidence of this, but the Romans certainly knew what was going on. They had to know. It was their business necessity to know what was going on the other side of the border. It strikes me as a model for what then happens in Rome. This is happening in the third decade. That's Artaxerxes in the third decade of the 3rd century. And
just one question: would you say the Achaemenids were predecessors in any sense, or do you view this as something that specifically occurs in this sort of late antique period?
Well, they were worshippers of Ahura Mazda, so they were Zoroastrians, but they didn't insist that there be a state church. So Zoroastrianism was around. It was prevalent among the Persians. It was the favored cult of the Persian kings, but it really wasn't the kind of centralized hierarchical faith that was considered to be the faith of the Persian Empire. That's what Artaxerxes and the Sasanians contribute to it. So yeah, I mean, he didn't invent the religion, and he didn't make it important. It was already an important religion, but he changes its relationship to the state, and he sees the relationship of religion and the state in new ways. You know, the older period was what was the famous Gibbon remark. They looked around, the pagan emperors looked around the Roman world, and they saw lots and lots of religions. And Gibbon says, if I have this correct, the people regarded them as equally true, the philosophers as equally false, and the statesmen, i.e. the emperors, as equally useful. So they're all pretty much, the emperors would make their sacrifices to all kinds of gods. That would have been true of the Achaemenids as well. But that kind of thing changes. Now you have an official state cult that is the empire's faith. It's not true that the Sasanians then go ahead and start stamping everything else out. They don't go as far as the Christians and the Muslims do. But you do get, early on, the beginnings of a kind of Persian Inquisition run by the high priests, in which those Zoroastrians who they did not think were doing it the right way are suppressed or punished, or they have their temples taken away from them. And eventually there are some persecutions of people of other faiths, of Hindus and Buddhists and Christians. It does not become, during the Sasanian times, it does not become as monolithic on the ground as it will be in Christianity and Islam, but the basic template is there. So this coincides with what is known as the Roman anarchy, which starts shortly after Artaxerxes. And in fact, a stronger Persian regime is probably one of the things that triggers it. It strains the Roman abilities to control their borders, essentially. And the Roman Empire, for almost 50 years, collapses into a series of civil wars and coups and barbarian invasions.
You had one Roman emperor who was captured, right? Was it Valerian?
That's by Valerian, by the Sasanians, yeah. So you really have troubles in the Roman world. Again, Gibbon has the famous line that the Roman emperors, in very short order, typical Roman emperor of this period, would in very short order go from the hut to the throne to the grave. You uneasily lay the head that wore the diadem during this period. So Roman emperors are kind of looking around how to bolster their very perilous positions. And some of them are doing things that suggest that, they think the idea of a state church might help. You have the Emperor Aurelian, for example, who one of the more successful of this period, who comes up with the notion of making the cult of the sun, Sol Invictus, the imperial, the official church. You have the persecution of Christians, which becomes systematic during this time. It's episodic, but when it occurs, it's systematic. It's across the empire, and there, they're not sacrificing for the emperor. They're not doing their bit religiously to support the empire.
Sorry, I mean, this was one of the questions I was going to ask you. So, if you look, for example, at the Areopagus of Augustus, there's an image of him in the robes of a priest. He was the Pontifex Maximus. And from what I've read, for example, of Pliny, when the instructions he received from Rome about how to deal with the Christians was that they should offer incense to an image of a Roman god. Maybe it was the Roman emperor. So the question that I have for you is, I agree that, it seems clear that the Romans let you worship what you wanted to worship, but it seems like one of the requisites was that you also worship the Roman gods, right? That in other words, by rejecting the Roman gods, the Christians were, from the Roman standpoint, it seems, unpatriotic, right? Because the gods are the protectors of the city, and these Christians, because of their religious exclusivism, are refusing worship to the gods who protect the city, and therefore are sort of outside the bounds of the of Roman tolerance. Couldn't you say that in a certain way, the pre-Christian Roman religion powerfully melded church and state to the point that your loyalty to the Roman gods, at least symbolically, was in some way your loyalty to Rome, and that the fact that the Christians had this dual loyalty, as it were, made them in Roman eyes unpatriotic, right? Because they were loyal to this god and church, which was a rival authority. Is that possible?
Well, yeah, sure. Well, for most of Roman imperial history, the earlier part of Roman imperial history, you were expected, if you were a subject, to make a sacrifice to the emperor's genius, his kind of individual god, and maybe even worship him as a god outside of Rome itself. And the Christians wouldn't do this. The general attitude, though, up until the middle of the 3rd century, there were periodic persecutions on a local basis. And if Christians were too in your face, they can get in trouble. But the real attitude was don't ask, don't tell. More or less, they were left alone. But this begins to change as the empire goes into crisis, because then it begins to be seen as a disloyalty in time of war. When the empire's doing okay, all right, you got these eccentrics around, if they lay low, the hell with them. But once, in the case of Decius, who's the first emperor in 250 to launch a empire-wide, really fierce persecution, he's up in the north fighting barbarians. There's a plague sweeping through Rome. He's just murdered his predecessor, and he's worried about what's going to happen to him. You really have this kind of sense of being the empire being convulsed in crisis, and so that creates a difference in degree, but it's a very significant difference in degree. And it goes along. Yeah.
What I'm trying to get at is less sort of the details of the persecutions and more the conception, right? So I think you could think back to ancient Athens, where you have the Parthenon on top of the Acropolis, right? Where Athena Parthenos is the protector of the city of Athens. So it seems as though the polis and the religious cultus are sort of bound together in a kind of unity, right? To be loyal to Athens is in some sense to, a demonstration of loyalty might be to honor the god of the city. And that's
sure. And Socrates, one of the charges against Socrates is impiety. It was always there. Yeah.
Yes, I'm just wondering, but the Christians kind of had a conception in which Well, Augustine famously formalizes it, the two cities, right? Where the ultimately important city is not even your earthly loyalty to any type of nation or empire or anything else, but to this otherworldly kingdom. He's living in Christian times, and he refuses to give a full sacralization of the Roman state, even though it was a Christian state. So I'm just wondering whether this was part. I mean, can we say that there was? I mean, can we say that there was not a religious sacralization of Greek and Roman societies before Christianity, and wasn't some of the tension and sort of the different conception of the role of religion that was coming into play?
Well, it was local. It was more relaxed. I mean, you could have lively philosophy in the ancient Greek city-states. You could have people who, didn't think the gods counted for anything in particular, like the Epicureans. You could get away with much more. It wasn't as if there were no limits, but the limits were very wide after Christianity. So my historical narrative is that Constantine, at the end of this process, is sort of picking up on what's already been done over the border. He's creating his own different state church. It has the same characteristics. So now you have these exclusivist monotheisms on both sides of the border. Zoroastrianism maybe is diarchy, but it's close. You have these exclusivist religions. Both are claiming that they are the only path to salvation. They both have a day of judgment in which the wheat and the chaff will be separated. They both have created a canon. So Constantine, calls the Council of Nicaea and all this. They both have a body of orthodoxy that the state supports and that buttresses the church. And if you are opposed to it, the stakes are now incalculably higher than what they were in late antiquity, where there was a much more relaxed attitude. If things got hot in one city, you could go to another city. It just is a changed world in that sense. And the end of the story is that in the 7th century, during a ferocious war that goes on for about a quarter of a century itself, wrecking both empires between the Romans, now the East Romans, and the Persians, Muhammad is beginning his career as a prophet. And there's actually a surah in the Quran called the Romans, in which it's often translated as the Byzantines, but it's actually Rumi. It's the Romans, in which he says...
Well, the Byzantines didn't call themselves Byzantines either, right? So
that's right. They called themselves the Romans. Right to the end, they called themselves Romans. So he says, the Romans have been defeated in the nearby lands. I guess if he was a Russian today, he'd say in the near abroad, they have been defeated. But with God's support, they will triumph. So he's making a prediction about the outcome of this big war. And indeed, that's what happens finally. The interesting thing about this war, which starts slightly before Muhammad gets busy down in Arabia preaching, is that the Romans, in their adversity, when Constantinople is being besieged by the Persians, and so much of the rest of their empire, extending even to Egypt, has been overrun by the Persians, they turn it into, and this is a first, they turn it into a holy war. In that they start talking about the protection of the Virgin for Constantinople, the necessity of all the churches melting down their treasure so as to fund the counterattack. They have to get back the true cross, which when Jerusalem fell to the Persians had been carted off to Mesopotamia. They do eventually get that back, and it's paraded around with great ceremony. They turn it into a religious war, and Muhammad, no doubt, is taking notes. And you get with Islam, with the preaching of Muhammad, you get a very politicized, very aggressive from the outset. With Christianity, military aggression is an add-on. It's not a feature of the original faith. But with Islam, it is. It's a movement for conquest under the banner of the Prophet from the very first. And I don't think it couldn't have been successful unless it was able to, as it was, evoke this millennial narrative that goes all the way back to Zoroastrianism and comes to Christianity to some degree through Judaism and the Babylonian exile, and then goes to Islam and develops this further facet, important facet. So that leads to another major consequence of late antiquity. It's not only that the millennial narrative gets captured by politics with vast implications for the future and how people see themselves in the world. It's also that the enormous burst of energy this gives. Well, obviously, you could see some of it in Heraclius's successful counterattack against the Persians, but the enormous burst of energy it then gives to Islam, allowing it in a short period of time to not only capture most of what we now call the Middle East and Iran, but North Africa into Spain. This enormous burst of energy divides the Mediterranean in a very fundamental way, much more than it had been divided previously. It had been, up to that point, kind of Hellenized, east or west. It was Latin Hellenization in the west, Greek Hellenization in the east. But
well, it's kind of strange, right? Because, I mean, like in Herodotus, there is kind of the beginning of Herodotus, you do get this sort of sense of this east-west, like he talks about Europe and Asia, but then after Alexander, it seems like you had kind of a marriage, a Hellenized culture, which the Byzantines seem to inherit. Let me just pause for a moment.
Finish my point here. So you have about 800 years, Alexander to the 7th century, during which the Mediterranean basin, even the Latin portions of it, are Hellenized in culture. That will now end, and the Mediterranean basin, which is really the fulcrum of empire in West Eurasia, it's the thing around which big empires can be built. You need bodies of water, is fundamentally divided in a way that will prevent the kind of empire Rome represented from appearing again throughout the Mediterranean, but particularly in the Christian part of it, which no longer has the resources to create the kind of empire that Rome was. And that's tremendously important for the rest of Western history. So you have one, Western history absorbing the millennial narrative, and two, as a result of this millennial narrative doing its work around the Mediterranean basin, the West, the northwestern part of Eurasia, the very far western part, a western part of Eurasia, losing the resource base to rebuild what the Romans had originally created, and that is a kind of a universal type imperium in that part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, Henri Pirenne, his famous thesis, right? It was his just a few words. He said, "Without Islam, the Frankish Empire would probably never have existed, and Charlemagne without Muhammad would be inconceivable." Right. So he seems to present us a picture of a Mediterranean-centered world of classical antiquity, which now shifts. First of all, Northern Europe becomes much more important, right?
Yes.
As Charlemagne and the Germanic tribes create a coherent Latin Christian civilization there, and then you have basically these rivals of Europe and the Islamic Middle East dividing what was once a unified classical Mediterranean. But Miles has been patiently sitting there, so I just wanted to ask you, Miles, do you have any? I mean, I have some questions and thoughts of my own, but I was wondering if you had any questions that you wanted to ask Steve.
No, not only is this interesting to listen to, I'd actually like to see the different perspectives on this line of discussion play out. And then afterwards, towards the end, I'll have one question from a rather different frame, I think.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, there's an awful lot of what you said, Steve. So let me go back to one of the issues that you discussed, which was the perception that the new monotheisms are hostile to philosophy, and I guess to classical culture. Well, I don't know if you mean in classical culture, but philosophy specifically. So, I mean, one thing I was reading was an article by Pierre Riche, who argued that the decision, so within Judaism as well, right, there was this quarrel between the Hellenists and the anti-Hellenists, right? Should Judaism engage with Greek culture, which had dominated the Mediterranean, or should it try to maintain its traditional monotheism? I mean, that's related to the Maccabees and this sort of thing. But he argues that one of the real turning points of history was the question of whether Christians should enter the Greco-Roman schools, right? Because they had a choice. The church, as it was growing, had a choice. They could have created their own schools and kept a kind of rigorous approach of everything pagan is bad, right? So don't read Homer, don't read Aristotle, don't read Plato, etc. And some Christians took that line. Tertullian famously said, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem, the church with the academy?" And he wore his lack of classical learning that was so revered as a kind, right? We talked about that he speaks plainly as a common person and not in the pride of the Attic porticos and this sort of thing. But what Riche argues is that the decision of the Christians to enter the Greco-Roman schools, to be teachers and students, like Augustine was a teacher of rhetoric, for example, meant that Christianity would not be merely a subculture within Europe, right, within the Greco-Roman world, but would actually absorb the letters, classical letters, and so forth, right? So that and so this is what allowed for a synthesis, right? I mean, so rather than, let's say, having your own kind of religious school where you keep out all pagan influences, the church made a decision to learn, absorb Greek and Latin, and absorb to a fair degree the classical letters, so that sometimes reinterpreting them, right? So Virgil becomes a prophet of Christ and this sort of thing. And Clement of Alexandria spoke of the Greek philosophers as being similar to the Jewish prophets in forecasting, let's say, or whatever the word is, the coming of Christianity. But aren't these signs that there was a certain amount of openness of Christianity to its Greco-Roman environs, that it's not simply a narrative of rejectionism, but of kind of discretion? What are we going to, what can we absorb, what can't we absorb?
Right. I didn't say that philosophy was closed down.
Right.
I said it was put under some constraints. So with things that you could say in some of the schools disappear altogether, partly because
Epicureanism
lost. Yeah, and Stoicism.
Epicurus was not as popular as Plato.
Skepticism. I mean, really. Yeah. Things like so there's a narrowing of discourse, but it's quite true. Many of Augustine was a lawyer and rhetorician prior to becoming a Christian. Many of the Christian intellectuals were trained in the classics before they became Christians. This was their heritage, and they weren't going to just casually toss it away. The Roman Empire itself traced its lineage back to Augustus and to pagans. There was a sense of continuity. So this was rather different from the case of Islam. For Islam, this was the term often used, this was foreign knowledge. It was useful, some of it was anyway, and had to be absorbed. And in the first Islamic centuries, when they're just the minority, really, the ruling minority, and they find themselves engaged in discourse with the Christians who are already there, those people come armed with philosophic weaponry, and they felt they had to have it themselves. So they begin translating Greek philosophical, usually from Aramaic rather than from Greek, but they're translating it. They also want to know about astrology, because that's that's how you predict that's how you know about everything. You look up, regard it as a science. So they need astronomy, and they need astrology, and they need mathematics, and they need logic. But one of the things about the Muslims is they're not really interested, as the Christians remain interested, in, say, ancient history. They don't want to. They're not concerned. Alexander figures in their sort of myth, but they're not concerned about the history of Greece and the history of Rome. They're not concerned about the literature. They don't have to turn Virgil into an early prophet because they don't read him. But that's true in the West. So it's a more superficial, culturally superficial and somewhat distanced access of
Christians. Is kind of like these pagans are our ancestors, right? I mean, in some sense.
And they were, yes. And it's not.
But I mean, I'm thinking also as we look at, let's say, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. I mean, one thing I've read is that the whole thing of the Middle Ages of the 7 liberal arts came from Marcianus Capella, who was a pagan in the late, or pagan author in the late Roman Empire, and that sort of educational curriculum seemed to become part of monastic education in the early Middle Ages, so that rhetoric and Aristotelian logic, which was about the only thing translated in the West, into Latin until the 12th century, but there was a kind of basis of the old classical liberal arts, even when you look at monastic. I mean, in some sense, you could say that they're sort of islands of Romanitas, of aspects of Romanitas in this barbarian sea, right? Which was right. I mean, is that, or do you think that's not a fair characterization?
No, it is. They were, learned people of the time, Cassiodorus, for example, people like that, were concerned about preserving these old works in an environment in which you couldn't take it for granted, and worked very hard to do it. So the attitude in the Christian world was quite distinct in an important way from the attitude in Islam. That said, of course, the Eastern Mediterranean that the Muslims controlled was much more urbanized and richer, and it lent itself to an intellectual life in the way that the barbarian west of the Mediterranean didn't. And so the first kind of revival of philosophy after Antiquity occurs among the Muslims.
Now, weren't a lot of the translators in the Abbasid Caliphate sort of refugees or descendants of refugees from the Byzantine Empire, like Christian sects? Weren't there a lot of like Nestorian?
I think they were mainly Christians who were living in those areas, though. Harun al-Rashid, I believe it was him, sends a deputation to Constantinople to take a look at their texts. And some say that the East Romans or the Byzantines at this point say to themselves, "Hey, we have all these good texts. Maybe we should look at them ourselves." In any event, so the power of the Greek inheritance is so mighty that everyone in contact with it becomes interested in it. But there are degrees how deep it goes. The Muslims look on it in a kind of pragmatic way. These are tools. Whereas the Christians look at it more in a heritage way. This is what we get from those who came before us and on whom we build, even if we're Christians now and they weren't. So I think that's one of the key differences.
I mean, you seem to have a structure of education in the Christian world, even if you look at the universities, where you begin with the liberal arts, right? The classical liberal arts. That's why we still talk about bachelors of arts and masters of arts and these sorts of things, and then you would move on to one of the higher faculties like theology or law or something like that. So I mean, I guess a question would be then also in terms of the Islamic world, obviously you have an engagement with the Greeks as well, even if, as you say, there were parts of their culture that did not hold the same interests, like Greek literature and Greek history, or Greco-Roman history and literature. But I guess one question would be, there is a general perception that at a certain point that engagement with the Greeks tended to fizzle. I'm just curious what you think about that idea, because there are others who say that there were continuations of Islamic philosophy that just the Western world wasn't that interested in past the Middle Ages. But others say there was a kind of, I think there was even a book was it Robert Riley about the closing of the Muslim mind, that argued that there was a kind of closure at a certain point.
So both those statements are true. on the one hand, it is the case that in the Arab speaking parts and eventually in the Turkish speaking parts of the Islamic world, interest in the Greek heritage waned. It didn't disappear. They remained interested in astronomy. They were Ptolemaic astronomers right down to they learned about Copernicus much later. They continued to study logic in the madrasas. You could find, and they think logic is important in terms of Islamic jurisprudence. You could certainly have found translations into Islamic of Arabic texts. They didn't of Greek texts, Aristotle, etc. Avicenna, people like that, Ibn Sina. But if you look a little further east in Persia, there the interest in Greek thought continues more robustly, right down to the present. And there, its expression is in Neoplatonism, which gets married to Sufi mysticism. And so you have, in the 16th and 17th centuries, the famous school of Isfahan and Mullah Sadra and people like that, who are using the concepts of Neoplatonism. They think it's Aristotle, by the way. They think that Plotinus.
I've noticed that the Islamic world, my sense is that the idea of a quarrel between Plato and Aristotle was much less a feature of the way of the readings of the ancients in the Islamic world. Like Avicenna, as well, as kind of an Aristotelian and a Neoplatonist. Yes.
Well, they were more aware of it early on. There's a fellow named Surawati, who's a 12th century mystics, actually executed by Saladin, who thought he was a dangerous, thought he was an Ismaili, which he wasn't. He had a dream, and in this dream, he was one of these early mystical Neoplatonist guys, and in this dream, Aristotle comes to him, and Aristotle tells him, when I was very old man, I realized Plato was right. And I agree with him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, another thing is, I mean, there could be an element of that in that a lot of the, but it would be more like the early Aristotle, right? I mean, because there's in Werner Jaeger's study of Aristotle's development, he notes that a lot of these early so-called exoteric texts, which were actually published, and where, according to Cicero, Aristotle's supposed to be this brilliant stylist. But they're in dialogical form. But it seems, for example, in terms of his conception of the soul and other things from the fragments, that he was much closer to Plato at least in his early period. So there's things also that we're missing. But Miles,
apparently, when he got old, he repented.
Right. I mean, it might be the other way around in terms of his biography. But Miles, did you want to ask anything or?
Yeah, I want to pick up on, I think, Alex, you began to ask about what interests me in your continuity questions over the last 10 minutes or so, but a very interesting discussion in which, we started off with a very large frame, a kind of macro millennial frame of, the emergence of a kind of henotheistic and then monotheistic tradition, its political echoes, a kind of eschatological religious cosmology worldview in which the present form of the world is passing away, and there starts to be some kind of precursor mirroring in the city of this world to the eventual city of God, and so on. And at the same time, we also heard some very interesting scholarly insights on the regimes, the political forms, and the institutions that ensured transmission and propagation of some of these cultures. So, absolutely think that's useful of understanding the power of schools and the traditions and the philosophical lines that they took on board. But I guess my background question is, for the audience and for myself, a kind of vague, open-ended question, perhaps. People sometimes talk about the distinction between the short duration of political regimes and then the permeation of the culture that they lived on and that they transmitted. So you think about the Roman world comes after Greek city-states, intermittent kingdoms, short-lived and broken up imperial ventures, but you get this long-lived Hellenic world. And in some ways, the Roman world is in many ways a Hellenic world where you get people in different parts of the empire at all kinds of stations speaking Greek. So this question of, when the Roman institutions and empire falls apart until the time of Charlemagne, to what extent or in through what ways is there a kind of permeation or persistence in any broad way of Greek and Roman worldviews and cultures?
In the West, you're talking about, or in the West. Well, first off, the barbarian rulers all become Christian, not all the same kind of Christian. Many are Arian Christians. Others are Catholic. There's a good deal of contest over that, and eventually everybody becomes Catholic one way or another. The Visigoths, Lombards, start off Arian, become Catholic. One of the prides of the Franks is they were Catholic from the beginning. So anyway, they're all Catholic. As such, they all recognize some kind of vague titular religious authority of the Patriarch of the West, who's someone will later call he's already called the Pope, but the papacy doesn't really exist yet. But nonetheless, there's this notion of Rome being the sort of the cultic center of their worship. The city has a prestige, even though it's much diminished in size. Nonetheless, is an important pilgrimage center in addition to having the Pope. So people are going there all the time to visit the tombs of Peter and Paul and other martyrs who are there. They understand that even though they're not part of it, usually, they understand that there is still a Roman Empire situated whose home base is Constantinople. And until the Muslims come along and take away its territory, it's by far the biggest polity around, even in its somewhat truncated form. My guess, by the way, is that if the Arabs hadn't come along and the Eastern Empire had remained as large as it was, say, under Justinian, who does try to reconquer the West, he fails, but he reconquers some of it, that there's a good likelihood it would have reconquered the West, like the Chinese dynasties that lost parts of the North would eventually reconquer them and reestablish a unity. But in any event, those Western barbarians would have thought of themselves as living in a world dominated by the Roman Empire. If they had any education at all, as Charlemagne did, would have been able to speak Latin, not necessarily read it, but it could be read to them. But they knew it. So in that sense, they were still speaking the language of the ancient Romans. They had a limited amount of Roman philosophical and scientific literature available to them, but they did have a vast body of patristic thought that made reference to Roman antiquity. They could see around them all the remnants of Rome, the decaying amphitheaters and the buildings and whatever. Some of them continued to be used as palatial structures. So there was lots and lots of Rome on their minds. I mean, it's not surprising that it seemed plausible to Charlemagne that he could be crowned Roman emperor. And he thought he was when he was so crowned. So there was, even though things were diminished and impoverished, the Roman world lived on in tangible and intangible ways.
Yeah, I mean, we started off talking a little bit about periodization. I think one of the interesting things is, it seems to me, if you look at medieval historians like Otto of Friesing, there is this idea, the periodization. Nobody in the Middle Ages thought of themselves as living in the Middle Ages. They thought of themselves as being in the last of the empires before what you were talking about earlier, the Eschaton, right? Which was the Roman Empire. And Otto of Friesing talks about a translatio imperii, when the Pope in the year 800 crowns the Frankish king Charlemagne, and makes him the Roman emperor, right? So there's a translation of the Roman imperium to the barbarian, as it were. But it seems to me that our idea of the Middle Ages comes from the irk, or the sense of affront that Italian Renaissance humanists felt.
Yeah.
The idea that these Germanic barbarians were the continuation of Rome, right? These Northern European, cavemen, basically, in their eyes, would be the heirs of Virgil and Cicero and so forth. And so you have this new emphasis, it seems, on the fall of Rome. There being a moment in time, or a short period, where Rome fell. You have this 1,000-year period of the decline of the classical world, and then the hope of a Renaissance. But there's lots of Renaissances. I mean, right? I mean, there's a Carolingian Renaissance. Some talk about a 12th century Renaissance. So the process of recovery of classical learning doesn't seem to me to be something that only occurs in the 14th and 15th century, right? I mean, obviously, the translations of Aristotle are going on in the 12th century for the West, anyway. So
what you're saying is that the term Middle Ages is a reflection of 15th century identity politics.
I think there's an element of that, and interestingly enough, you also have the Germanic reaction to classicism. In later on with Herder in the late 18th century, where because the French were also neoclassicists. We are the descendants of the Romans and so forth, and this culture, true beauty is Greek and Roman beauty. And then the Germans were saying, no, this culture, that's when the Romantics were pushing the Middle Ages as this period of chivalry and these unique values and so forth, like Fichte and Herder and the German Romantics that, but I mean, anyway, there's multiple elements of synthesis between the Middle Ages, between Germanic and Latin, as well as between, we could say, Athens, Jerusalem, Rome.
Yeah, sure.
Lots of these elements going on. I guess it's another topic that would be interesting to discuss that you mentioned was the impact of Islam on Europe. How would you? I mean, what you touched on that, but what's your general? Because I know you've written on it. What's your general perspective on this?
Well, obviously, when Europe is ready, so to speak, it's a treasure chest of Hellenistic knowledge and commentary on Hellenistic knowledge, interpretation of Hellenistic knowledge. So that's very important. It's the great other for the Christian world, what it sort of defines itself against. It I think gives to the Christian world some of its militants. On the one hand, I was arguing that Muhammad may have been learning from Heraclius, but on the other hand, the concept of a crusade, an out-and-out crusade, comes in the wake of the Islamic conquests. So when religious warfare begins to develop on a sustained basis in the West, the first real example of this, I think, is Charlemagne's campaigns against the Saxons, where he destroys the great tree whose name I can't pronounce, Irumsul or something like that. I think that's a borrowing in some sense from Islam. It wasn't like they had a lot of, nowadays every civilization in the world is represented cuisine-wise in the West. So you have lots of, but I don't think they had a lot of Middle Eastern restaurants in medieval. So it was a bugaboo mainly. When it wasn't a source of all this kind of scientific literature. They were more interested, of course, this is a point famously made by Bernard Lewis. The Christians were always, relatively speaking, more interested in the world of the Muslims than the Muslims were interested in the world of the Christians, except, of course, at the very beginning when the Muslims are translating all this stuff. But after that phase is over, they didn't really think, and they were looking, after all, at a much more impoverished world than their own. They really didn't think that they had much to learn from the Christian West, and that mentality stuck until they really started losing a lot of wars.
That was probably a wake-up call when Napoleon turned up in Egypt, right?
Or even earlier when they suffered a lot of defeats in the Balkans. So the West does do things like, in the 13th century, you actually have I can't remember who it was, but you have a priest, a scholastic, who translates the Quran into Latin. Not very well, but give him a break on that. He's the first guy to do it. I recently had an opportunity to ask a friend of mine who's a Muslim, who comes from Egypt, whether most Muslims would, if a Muslim went to a imam, a holy man, and he said, would it be a good idea for me just to sort of deepen my knowledge? I'm not going to go off the reservation and convert, but just to sort of deepen my knowledge of what is referred to in the Quran. Would it be a useful thing for me to read a copy of the Hebrew scriptures translated, say, into Arabic? And he told me, he's not really an expert, but I think he's has a good sense of this. No, they'd think that it was certainly not necessary or important. All the things you had to know about the Hebrew tradition were in the Quran. Going there was not particularly important. Now, of course, the Christians had this debate before they became the official religion, long before, in the second century. They themselves have this debate, and there was a very influential Christian leader named Marcion, a Sinope, who came to Rome. He was very wealthy. He was throwing money around. He had a big following. Genuine, I think. He's regarded as an arch heretic, but he was a genuine religious leader. And it was his position that the Hebrew scriptures represented so it was so antithetical to everything that Jesus stood for and preached, that it was the work of the demiurge, of this sort of inferior God who didn't know he wasn't God and preached all this nonsense to the Hebrew people and should be discarded. And his own canon, I think, was Luke plus 7 or 8 letters of Paul that he thought were authentic. So there was a debate over this, and incredibly important decision made. And there were good grounds for making it. I mean, after all, Jesus was a Jew and certainly was immersed in Hebrew scripture. You can see that in all sorts of things he says. They decide, however, to accept. So very early on, there is, I think, in the West, I don't know if I could connect with any degree of intellectual rigor this early religious part of it to the much later view of Islam, but there does seem to be throughout the Western history a kind of greater interest than
Well,
most other
that's why I
civilizations had
mentioned
in the
the
outside
sort
world.
of fateful historical decision to enter the Greco-Roman schools, right, where Christians would have been learning about the Greek gods and Achilles and and all this. Homer was sort of the an early foundation. There were rigorous voices within the church that thought everything pagan was unclean and you should just stay away from it. But I mean, the fact that in the end, I mean, but the Byzantines adopted large parts of the
Yeah,
Greco-Roman
right.
schools. So the fact that there was that openness to the Greco-Roman culture, arguably evinces like what you're saying. I think
Hmm.
there's a certain kind of openness, and obviously you have differences within the Islamic world, right? Between Averroes's defense of the philosophers, right? So you had Al-Ghazal writing The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and Averroes responding with The Incoherence of the Incoherence. So
Right.
obviously these debates between rigorous and the more open ones have occurred in different cultures. Another question that I was curious about is this process of estrangement between the Greek and Roman worlds, because when we're talking about the high classical period, right, a figure like Cicero would be thoroughly bilingual, right?
Right.
And even Marcus Aurelius dies in 180, right? 180 AD, writes his meditations in Greek, right? Even though he's a Roman emperor. But there seemed to be a process. I mean, one of the fateful things about the Middle Ages seemed to be the loss of Greek, right? Really, until the Renaissance, it didn't really come back. So, what do you think accounts for the estrangement between the Greek and Roman things? I mean, even the fact that translations are coming of Aristotle from Arabic in Spain and Sicily, right, where Muslims and Christians, not directly between the Byzantine world and the Catholic world. So beyond the obvious religious split that doesn't really seem to get cemented until about the 11th century, but there seem to be processes of estrangement between these two wings of the classical world long before. So what do you think accounts for that?
Well, you do get Saint Jerome translating this Christian scripture and the Jewish scripture
Yep.
into Latin, so they
Yep.
have this kind of canonical. The thing most read, after all,
Yes.
in these early ages was the Bible. They had it. They had it in Latin. Um, I guess I just speculate. And first of all, it's not altogether true that there weren't people who knew Greek
Right. There was
in
John
the Dark
Stuart
Ages.
Eugenist.
Yes, right. He's one, but he wasn't the only, absolutely only
Yeah.
person who knew Greek.
It
You
seemed
could
to
have,
depend partly on which monastery you were in, like what was in
yeah, right. When
monastic
they had it
library.
right, and had you gone to Rome, the city of Rome,
Yeah.
at any time during this period, you would have found Greek-speaking priests there. So it wasn't as if the Emperor Otto III marries a Greek princess, a Byzantine princess. It wasn't absolutely unknown. I guess I'd say, and I'm guessing, that when you have a society that's relatively poor and it can't support intellectual life at a very high level, there aren't that many people around who can do it. It's probably going to be satisfied more with what it has. You don't have all these people out there yet who are capable of journeying to Spain to translate documents out of Arabic. It's just sort of the slow pace of life. It takes a long time to recover from an economic and hence intellectual collapse, and they just stuck with what they had. That's my guess.
Miles, did you have anything you wanted to add or ask?
Not at this point, because I think we've covered a fair amount of ground and we've turned a large jewel around quite a few facets. So there's a fair amount taken at one sitting, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of at the hour point, but I mean, Steve, is there anything you wanted to say in summation, as it were?
Well, come and take a look at my website, the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization at Texas Tech. I'd be delighted if there's anybody who's interested in what they've heard me say to contact me. If you want an email, it's Steve, S-T-E-V-E .Balch, B-A-L-C-H, at TTU, as in Texas Tech University, .edu.
Outstanding. Well, thank you. I thought, speaking personally, I thought it was a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion of a lot of interesting issues, and maybe a topic, it seems as though a lot of classics majors stop around Marcus Aurelius. So this whole topic of late antiquity is, I think, one which is extremely fertile. I mean, given how much we've just discussed was going on during this period, and definitely worthy of greater attention. So thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, for joining us. It's very much
Alex. Thank you, Miles.
And take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Till next time.